This stacked bar graph that I made in Unity is meant for displaying a continuous stream of data and different categories of data across that stream. My intended implementation of this graph component is networking graphs, but if this way of pushing the information to the graph doesn't work for you, say the data needs to be displayed all at once, or it updates dynamically after it's been displayed, the scripts are pretty simple, so you shouldn't have much trouble editing the graph to work for you. The code is in the GitHub repository in the description. So how the graph works is you push a value to it that corresponds to one of the data categories, and after you've pushed all those values, you display them by creating a new column. As you can see here in my test script, all I'm doing is every 30 fixed update calls, I'm pushing a random value between 0 and 150 to each of the data categories, and then calling to display those values. That's it. That's all you have to do in order to display your information on the graph. For an example of how this works in a networking workflow, I have a multiplayer game I'm working on where I want a debug graph that shows how many bytes are in different parts of a packet being sent to the client. So in my script, I have these lines which are measuring how much data is in each part. You can see when I'm pushing my data, I'm using a string instead of an index to identify which category I'm pushing my data to. I've just made an additional method that looks up the category based on its string instead of the index. Here's that code if you want to copy it. And every tick I'm calling to display those values, so this is what the graph looks like when the game is running. Mind, these gaps are there because a packet is only received every third tick in my game, so these gaps are supposed to be there, and they actually prove that the graph is updating properly in this case. This is what the graph looks like in my test scene when the data is being fed to it continuously. You can see the labels at the bottom describe which color coordinates with which data category. You can see in the hierarchy different bar columns being cyclically generated and destroyed. And if we pause and go into one of these columns, you can see it's just a few images being aligned with a vertical layout group, and all the columns together are aligned with a horizontal layout group. In the inspector, you can also see all the settings. You can set categories colors, the column count, which is just the number of columns, max column sum. So the column sum is just if you added up all the different values that make up a column. So if a column's value is the max value, then it will take up the entire height of the graph, 100% of the height. So the max column sum isn't really a maximum, it's just required for scaling the columns on the graph. So you can increase and decrease that if you want to scale them. There's also default column values mode. This just means that after you display a new column, do you want to make the default values for the next column before you push any values to them? Do you want to make those default values 0 or the last column's values? This is useful if you're calling display at a fixed rate like me in my project and you don't know if data is going to be pushed in time. You can just set it to clear so it shows up as 0 on the graph like with my own implementation. Or you can set it to the last column's values if you don't want any abrupt gaps in the graph. So that's the graph. If you have any questions, issues, or want to share some extensions of the project that you've made, you can do that in the comments. I'll try my best to respond.